Lavrentiy Beria was a name that inspired fear even among those at the pinnacle of Soviet power. He did not just become the head of the NKVD. He turned this structure into a suppression machine that controlled the fate of millions. But how did an ordinary party worker from Georgia manage to rise to such heights? It all began in 1931, when Beria became secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Georgia. Even then, he showed his cruelty and cunning. He eliminated competitors not just physically, he skillfully used denunciations and intrigues, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. This ability to weave intrigue and find enemies of the Soviet people quickly drew Stalin's attention to him. In 1938, Beria became deputy head of the NKVD and then its head. This was the peak of the Great Terror, a time when millions of people disappeared without a trace. Beria personally controlled the fates of thousands of people. He signed orders for shootings and arrests, deciding who would live and who would die. But his power was not limited to the extermination of enemies. He managed to instill fear even in those who stood close to him. High-ranking officials were afraid to get on the lists of enemies of the people. One of Beria's main talents was the ability to manipulate Stalin. He instilled in the leader the idea that there are a lot of traitors around, and only Beria can expose them. Stalin trusted him because Beria always provided evidence, fabricated cases, denunciations, and confessions, beaten out by torture. Even Stalin's inner circle could not feel safe. When war hit the USSR in 1941, Beria became even more powerful. He became head of the NKVD and GRU, controlling intelligence, the army, and industry. Under his leadership, labor camps were set up in which millions of people worked for virtually free. These camps became the backbone of the Soviet economy during the difficult war years. But in the late 40s, Beria became even more dangerous. He no longer just served the system. He became its master. And it was then that his name became associated with unlimited power and cruelty. But even the most powerful people sometimes forget that their power rests on fear. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, the Soviet Union was plunged into chaos. The country was left without its cruel but strong leader, and each of his closest associates saw themselves as the new master of the USSR. But no one was as close to absolute power as Lavrentiy Beria. Beria immediately sprang into action. He proposed radical reforms, easing repression, amnesty for prisoners, and even easing the economy. These measures looked like an attempt to make the USSR gentler and more humane, but in fact it was a plan to consolidate his influence. Beria wanted to become the face of change, the man who would save the country from the fear created by Stalin. But behind these beautiful promises lurked a real threat. He began to embed his men in key government structures. In the Ministry of State Security, in the Army, and even in the KGB appeared his confidants. It was a whole network of agents and officials who reported to him on everything that was happening in the upper reaches of power. Beria controlled the information, which meant he controlled everyone. Soon, other members of the government began to realize that Beria was not going to stop. For them, he became not just a political rival, but a mortal threat. His reforms looked like preparations for a complete seizure of power. Khrushchev and Zhukov understood. If they do not stop Beria now, tomorrow they themselves will be his victims. But Beria was confident of his invulnerability. He felt himself the master of the situation. Under his control were power structures, intelligence, and counterintelligence. No one could oppose him openly. He was sure that his power was unshakable. But one thing he hadn't taken into account was that the fear he had created over the years was beginning to work against him. The fear that had paralyzed his enemies under Stalin was now their main motivator. They realized that if they didn't remove Beria, he would remove them. Khrushchev and Zhukov began meeting in strict secrecy. The meetings were held in different places, at dachas, in closed offices where no one could overhear them. Their plan was simple: to remove Beria before he himself did not eliminate them. Zhukov immediately took it upon himself to organize military support. He arranged with military units loyal to him so that at the right moment they could surround the Kremlin and take the building under guard. This was necessary to prevent Beria and his men from using force. In essence, it was a military operation designed in the strictest secrecy. But Khrushchev realized that military efforts alone were not enough. It was necessary to enlist the support of other members of the government. He began to act through trusted individuals, explaining to them that Beria was a mortal threat. People feared Beria, but they feared his unlimited power even more. Khrushchev skillfully exploited this fear. Soon most of the country's leaders supported his plan. Every meeting between Khrushchev and Zhukov was risky. They knew that if Beria found out about their plot, they would be destroyed. But the fear of being destroyed alone was stronger. They decided to act. Zhukov's army and Khrushchev's political support became the main weapons of the conspiracy. Now all that remained was to choose the moment to strike. They decided to do it suddenly, when Beria would be sure of his safety. On 16th June 1953, Moscow was in the usual summer heat. At the top of the Soviet government, everything seemed calm. Lavrentiy Beria, as usual, arrived for a government meeting. He was confident of his invulnerability. Behind him stood the secret services, an army of guards and a network of agents whom he himself had placed in key positions. What he didn't know was that this day would be his last day free. The meeting began as usual. Beria calmly talked about his plans for reform, felt confident among colleagues. But at some point, something changed. The doors of the hall opened and armed soldiers entered. At their head was Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The arrest order was read out right at the meeting. Beria tried to say something, but his voice was drowned in the general noise. He looked back at his guards, the very people who had sworn allegiance to him. But no one had even taken a step towards him. The men who yesterday had been ready to do his bidding today stood as if petrified. No one stood in his defense. No one even tried to intervene. Beria was quickly escorted out of the hall and then taken to a secret location where he was isolated. For the man who had held the entire country in fear for decades, it was a moment of complete helplessness. His power vanished in an instant. But how were the conspirators able to pull off the operation so easily? Why didn't the army and intelligence services that Beria controlled even try to protect him? That was their plan: surprise and determination. Zhukov left Beria no chance for resistance. Thus ended a day that changed the history of the USSR. But it was only the first step, and the worst for Beria began not at the moment of arrest, but when they began to prepare a case against him. The trial against Beria was secret. Officially, it was called a special meeting, but in fact it was a closed trial where everything had already been decided in advance. The charges against him were shocking. Beria was attributed treason. He was accused of allegedly collaborating with foreign intelligence, intending to betray the country. But the case was not limited to that. Beria's list of crimes included charges of mass repression, torture, illegal arrests, and executions. The documents indicated that thousands of innocent people were shot on his orders. And the worst thing is that many of these crimes really happened. But in the case files, there was a real hunt for his crimes. Many episodes were exaggerated or even fabricated. In order to hide the real scale of his activities, a few days before the trial, thousands of documents related to his orders and operations of the NKVD were destroyed. These were not just pieces of paper. They were proof of his absolute power, as well as evidence of his connections, his methods of work, and the people who served him. But now these documents had become dangerous to those who had eliminated Beria. At the trial, he tried to defend himself. He said that he acted in the interests of the country, that he carried out all orders according to the instructions of the leadership. But nobody listened to his words. The judges and prosecutors already knew what sentence would be passed. It was not a trial in the usual sense of the word. It was the destruction of an enemy who had become too dangerous even for his former comrades in arms. The trial lasted only a few days. Lavrentiy Beria's sentence was passed quickly and without hesitation. The court declared him guilty of high treason, mass repression, and other grave crimes. But most importantly, the sentence was a death sentence. No time was given for appeal or defense. The court's decision was final, and it was carried out almost instantly. On 22 December 1953, Beria was executed. Everything happened in strict secrecy. He was taken to a specially prepared room where his sentence was read to him. Lavrentiy Beria, who was accustomed to decide the fate of thousands of people himself, found himself in the face of death absolutely helpless. He tried to say something, tried to justify himself, but no one would listen to him. The shooter appointed to carry out the sentence was chosen from among those who personally hated Beria. The shot rang out quickly and accurately. It was the end of the man who for years had inspired fear in millions. At the moment when the bullet cut short his life, he was no longer the omnipotent master of the NKVD. He was simply a convict who had lost everything,